After a request to detail my bed leveling process, I went ahead and decided to make a video on it since apparently there are a bunch of YouTube videos that just fail to mention the one main important thing about bed leveling. All of them. They just refuse to mention it, I guess. The reason why all of us have problems figuring out bed leveling at first is because people are wrongly telling us that the gap between the nozzle and the bed should be 0.1 millimeter. It is not. Stop telling people this. Stop believing people that tell you this. That is wrong. The gap should be 0. Let that sink in. The gap should be 0. Alright, now we're going to go through the process here. Now first off, my machine is an Ender 3 Max, so it has a 300 by 300 millimeter bed. You'll need to adjust the process depending on, if you have a smaller machine or a larger machine, obviously. Second thing, I don't mess with the LCD screen, either controlling it through there or disabling the steppers so that I can manually move parts around. One thing I noticed after adjusting my Z-axis guide rails, that if I am trying to move the head by hand, it can actually move the end of this gantry. I don't want to mess with that, so instead of using any of that, I'll use the USB. It's connected to the dedicated laptop I have, and I'm going to control everything through Cura. One of the main reasons I like to do this, besides what I just mentioned, is that when you go through the LCD and use the steps that way, you're limited to 10 millimeters at a time. You got to turn the knob, get it right, position, and all that. Here, you don't have to do that. The Cura has the 0.11 10 millimeter, and just like the machine does, but it also has the 100 millimeter, which is what we're going to need for this big bed. So let me show you the process. Right now I've got it over the over one of the adjuster screws, but what I'm going to show you from the beginning. So say it's out anywhere in the field. What I do is go through here, do your auto home, and you can do this through the LCD if you want to do it that way and you don't have a computer. I just find this much easier and more accurate. So you auto home. Now there's been some question on auto homes. I don't, unless you've done some adjusting to your printer, and for some reason your auto home is not where it was factory, don't mess with it. If it's where it was factory, just leave it alone. It's fine. This is where it was. No point in changing it. So what I found on this big machine is that to get centered on top of the first adjuster knob, I need to go 33 millimeters in on the X-axis and 31 millimeters in on the Y-axis. Now, as you can see, that has centered me up with my adjuster screw. Now, from that point on, each adjuster screw on this model, on the 300, on the Ender 3 Max, each adjuster nozzle is 240 millimeters to center. So that'll make it easier to control here when we move it to the next one. So as for what type of gauge I use, I prefer a feeler gauge as to paper, because paper, if you have it too tight, will start to groove and change thickness based on just your adjusting. So if you're running it back and forth, it may cause a groove in there, and then when you go to the next one, it gets caught in that same groove, and you're actually less than what the original thickness of the paper was. It's not going to happen with a feeler gauge. Just get one. It's easier. Eventually you won't need it anyways, and you'll just use your eyeballs after you figure out that the gap is supposed to be 0, not 1. Now I can do this with my eyes, but let's do it for this way for now. So one of the main things you want to make sure is that your gap isn't too tight and you're pushing the bed down on the springs. You just want barely a little bit of resistance going through there. See, this one's a little tight. Oh, not yet. Because I forgot to do the one main important thing. Alright, so when I said that Your gap is not supposed to be 0.1 millimeter, it's supposed to be 0. The way to adjust for this when bed leveling is to raise your z-axis 0.1 millimeter. As you can see right here, well, since I already messed up, I'll show you. I cannot get this through there without really pushing it to get it through. Alright? So what we're going to do, you look over here, we're at 30 by 30 by 0. So we're going to come over here. You can also do this in the LCD screen, but again, it's much easier to control this way. Click on your 0.01 millimeter travel speed or distance. Click up on your Z. That raises your nozzle to 0.1 millimeter off the bed, off of where it's supposed to be. So then you get in here, hard to see, your nozzle. You can just barely see. This one's a little loose, so we're gonna tighten it just a little bit. And you want just a little bit of resistance there. And the reason you want resistance, so for one, if you're using paper, paper is not exactly 0.1 millimeter thick. It is variance. Even this feeler gauge is 0.102 millimeter. So you raised your head 1 millimeter, 0.1 millimeter, sorry. So this should have 0.002 millimeters of resistance through there. So you should be able to feel that little bit of scratchiness, but not enough to stop it, not enough to catch the edge as you're trying to go under it, right? So then from there, I go to the next one. And remember I said it's 240 millimeters to each one, so 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. Now again, please remember this 240 millimeters is just for this 300 millimeter bed on the Ender 3 Max. If you have a different model or your adjuster screws are different on the CR10s, I don't know if they are or not. They're in different positions. But for the Ender 3 Max, it's 240 between each of the adjuster screws. So again, you go through and set your gap, and you can see right there. See, that's a good example right there. Let me find it again. Oh, sorry, my arm was on the bed. See right there where the nozzle, the gap between the nozzle and the gauge disappears? See? Right there? That's how you're eventually going to adjust this by eye. When those two shadows barely connect, then that's where you're at. That's what you want. That's your 0 millimeter gap. All right. So this one's already level, so I'm not going to go around and do all 4 of them, but I would normally do that about 2 or 3 times, and then what I would do is from any of the corners go in 120 millimeters and then to the center at 120 millimeters, and that'll put you at dead center. And I test that one as well. And then if that one is not good, then I'll go back and readjust the other ones, and then until that one gets good. Now, remember the most important part of bed leveling this is to raise that z-axis 0.1 millimeter. And then when you're done leveling, you just go back and you home it. And that drops it to where you can see it's just perfect. This one might be a little thin, or a little above 0, but remember that this is just the initial bed leveling. You will do this constantly. Don't think you need to get a BLTouch because it's hard. It's not hard at all. The gap is supposed to be 0, not 0.1. Okay. Please stop teaching people this wrong way of doing it. Please stop listening to people that teach you to do it this way. The gap is 0. All right. Then, after you've gotten your bed leveled and you like where it's at, then you run your first layer test. Or you run your, I'm sorry, before you do your first level test, you want to make sure you do your extruder, your E-step test to make sure that you're running 100 millimeters when you tell it to run 100 millimeters, okay? Then you need to run a flow test to make sure that your flow rate isn't over extruding or under extruding, which would throw off your base layer test, all right, your first layer test. So I run these constantly. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and run a first layer on this, and then if it seems under extruded or over extruded, before I start adjusting the nozzles, you make sure your flow is right. If you don't have the flow right, then it doesn't matter what you adjust it, it's going to be off. It's just going to be off, right? You don't need glue sticks, you don't need blue tape, you just need to level your bed right. This is why so many people in the groups that are experienced get so frustrated with noobs asking questions, endless questions about what am I doing wrong, what am I doing wrong, what am I doing wrong. Well, it's kind of a failing on their part for not telling us noobs that the gap is supposed to be 0, not 1.1 or 0.1 millimeter. All right, I think I've beaten that dead horse enough now, but just in case, one more time, the gap is supposed to be 0, not 0.1 millimeter. All right, if you're trying to lay a 0.2 millimeter first layer down in a 0.3 millimeter gap, you're always going to have adhesion problems. Always. Doesn't matter, you're going to have them. Okay, and you don't need to mess with the other calibrations or print a thicker first layer. If you print a 0.28 millimeter first layer and then 0.2 millimeters the rest of the time, it's still going to be wrong because you tried to print that first 0.28 millimeter, or I'm sorry, yeah, 0.28 millimeter layer in a 0.38 millimeter gap. It's just wrong. Stop doing it. What else? I think that's it.